Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today, I would like to speak with you about the reaction of Russian generals to the war between Israel and Iran. In other words, the war of Israel and Iran as seen by the Russian generals. Now, the questions that were asked in their discussions are quite relevant and revealing about how the Russians see the war and what implications or conclusions they draw for themselves. Now, the most important thing, of course, is the discussion of the nature of the war as they seen it, what it has shown in terms of the tactics and the response of the Israelis and of the Iranians, and also some political implications on Russia. Now, the striking thing in their discussion was that the original plan, which they believed the Israelis had when they started the campaign, which what they call a modern warfare, a hybrid warfare. And they discussed a scenario when the drones fly from the territory of the country that is attacked, and then simultaneously there's the cyber attack on the command and control centers, and then there is a murder of the key commanders, and the decapitation of the leadership, and the activation of sleeper cells, and the disruption of the communications, and the sowing of public unrest and chaos, collapse of the government, and then a crushing blow of missiles onto the key centers of decision-making. So these are the kinds of elements that the Russian generals discuss happened. They actually took place. And of course, the Israelis and perhaps the Americans who stood behind them were very much counting that this is going to work. In fact, that was the plan. The plan was decapitation and overthrow of the regime in Iran. And of course, that is something that the Russian generals immediately said, that looks terribly familiar. Indeed, there were drones that flew out of containers in Russia and that did deliver strike at Russian airfields. And of course, the Ukrainians themselves have been talking for months, if not for a couple of years, about the golden dream is that the government in Russia collapses. That is just a little bit more push, a little more sanctions, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and Putin regime will collapse. And that was their main hope. In other words, when the Russian generals discussed the matter, it is applying what they had tried, what the Israelis and the Americans had tried in Iran, that is what perhaps could have been or would have been still used against Russia. And of course, the implications that the generals draw from this is that there has to be 3 tiers of leadership. There has to be decentralization of commanding units, as it is actually practiced now at the front line in Ukraine. Is that there should be very serious defense against cyber attacks and sufficient independence of field commanders to act independently if the center is for some reason paralyzed. So they were very seriously, I think this is probably the most serious concern that they had discussing the implications of the war. Now, on a more positive side, the Russian generals were very, very much impressed by the resilience of the Iranian system, but also of the Haybar-Shekan missile. And there was a lot of analysis of how it compares to the Israeli air defenses, how those compared to Patriot defenses, how those compared to S-400 defenses. And I'm not going to go into this technical detail because this is going to be quite uninteresting to the non-specialist. But the bottom line of that discussion that nobody can deny is that the ballistic missile under the name Haybar-Shekan proved to be absolutely extraordinary. It overcame not only the Iron Dome, but it also the THAAD defense system, missile defense system of the United States that was engaged. It had amazing capacities of maneuver and target navigation, and that was absolutely spectacular. They compared it to, the specialists compared to Iskander Russian ballistic missile, but they also said that the Oreshnik is bigger and better. Now, speaking about the future, they were now discussing that Iran is going to build a much more resilient air defense system, and the Chinese have taken the lead in this, and they have already started the work of, together with the Russians, details are not discussed, but providing Iran with a much more effective air defense system, and also Russian and Chinese aircraft that could meet the challenge of F-35s. And indeed, again, the military qualities of these aircraft is something for the specialists to consider. But what I hear and what I see in the discussion is that both the most modern Chinese fighter jets and the Russian Su-57 are equal, and in some measure superior to F-35. So this is about the military aspect of it. They have come to the conclusion that that Iran has shown for the first time in history something that in 1953, when the Americans overthrew the government of Mossadegh and installed the Shah of Iran, it would have been inconceivable that 70 years later Iran would emerge as a country that had developed its own ballistic missiles that could challenge the United States, could challenge Israel, and in fact could deliver a crushing blow to an adversary in the region, which of course includes American bases in the region and Israel. It also showed, the generals discussed, that American missiles, they're too expensive. And that is why after 2 weeks of fighting, Israel began to run out of those, and they cannot be easily replenished because the production of those, as Raytheon admitted, is only 650 a year, whereas nobody knows exactly how many Iran has, but it is in the thousands. In other words, they've been building up, they've been getting ready for an assault like this over 40 years, and it shows that their resilience was not to be crushed. Now, going on to the final conclusion about the discussion of this war, the Russian generals said that this war showed that it is a war of missiles, that this is a war of air defense capabilities. This is a war of domestic resilience, and this is a war of careful planning of defense as well as offense with new weapons. So going on to the political implications, the Russian generals were saying that this episode showed that there's no need to conclude anything with Trump, because he cannot be trusted, because he is not steady, because he says one thing one day and another thing another day. In other words, from the point of view of the Russian generals and many Russian observers, this whole episode of the 12-day war showed that Trump is not a partner one can deal with, because his word, just as that of Zelensky, isn't worth much. And therefore, Russia has to count on its own military force in achieving its objectives. Now, speaking about the NATO summit, on the one hand, everybody was aware that the question of Ukraine was hushed down, that Trump insisted that it be removed from conversation and so on. But that didn't really produce much of an effect on the Russian political observers and the Russian generals, because Rutte spoiled everything at the very end when he said that sometime in the future Ukraine's membership in NATO could be put back on the agenda. This is why Putin had insisted in his latest speeches at the Economic Forum that Russia needs a treaty. Russia will not believe in any promises. And this is why, despite the very, very active military advance in the last few days, Putin keeps repeating that he is willing to actually accept a compromise, and he needs a treaty that would define security arrangements in addition to the borders of Ukraine, and so on and so forth. Now, about the 5% military expenditure, again, the Russian generals responded that, first of all, two things. First of all, it would be very hard for them to reach that, because they're not in the capacity and their budgets are quite limited, and they would have a hard time convincing their publics to increase the military spending, and that there is really no threat from Russia. This is all made up because Europe is not Ukraine, and Ukraine is not in the European Union or in NATO. But also, they also said something that is only clear to the military men, and that is that if they are going to devote 3% of their military budgets to buying American equipment, this is not going to help them much, because American equipment is very, very expensive, and it would not help them to integrate their forces. In other words, the German military companies that produce Panzers will not gain a penny from it, and neither will the French, who produce their Centurions and their missiles and their aviation. So, in other words, it would be a complete waste of money. It would be buying equipment that would be sitting in storage somewhere in Poland, and would be a total waste of money for the taxpayers in their respective countries. It would actually delay, if not make it impossible, for them to ever integrate their various components and various systems. And of course, their armies speaking various languages, and their command structure is totally decentralized, etc., etc. So what they were basically saying, Russia has nothing to fear from the 3% increase, even if it happens. Speaking about the men under arms, if indeed they would create a powerful continental army of 1 million men, as they insist, Russian doctrine calls for the use of nuclear weapons. In other words, the Russians showed no particular fear from the increase. The only regret was it would be a new cycle of armament race, and it would make the use of nuclear weapons more likely rather than less likely. They also responded to the threats coming from Umerov, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, and from Zelensky, that that Ukraine will intensify the use of drones in the coming months, and that brings only to one conclusion: no negotiations could be led. In fact, one of the speakers at the discussion I had said, "Why don't we act like the Israelis? Why just we don't attack the Zelensky's headquarters and eliminate Budanov, who is essentially the leader of a terrorist organization that is assassinating Russian generals? Just why don't we get a little bit more tough with this regime?" Of course, none of them supports Putin's ideas of making a compromise, of compromising with anything, and all of them are now openly saying that the only way forward is to conquer Kiev and establish a government in Russia, absorbing a lot of Ukraine into the Russian Federation, and the rest of the Ukraine being a kind of a vassal state that would respect the security of its neighbor. So these are the kinds of conclusions they drew from this war. And finally, the threats of EU to impose sanctions and to use Russian money, Russian assets, financial assets that are seized in European Union. Putin himself responded to that in his remarks in Minsk at the Economic Forum, that if that were to happen, then more and more countries would abandon SWIFT, fearing for their own assets in Western banks, and they would hurt the Western Europe and Western banks more than the loss of these resources for Russia. In other words, then BRICS also would speed up the process of moving away from the dollar and from Western currencies and Western banks, and move on creating its own system of payments. That in that case, the losses of Europe would far exceed the 300 billion that they seized from Russia. So I finish at that. Thank you very much. I hope you will write your comments and put a like and subscribe to my channel and read my book, From Lenin to Putin. Thank you. Goodbye.